Have you ever noticed how certain people seem to disappear emotionally the moment things start getting real? At first, everything feels warm, natural, even exciting, and then suddenly something shifts. The messages become shorter, the conversations become distant, the energy changes. It feels like you're reaching for someone who slowly begins stepping back into the shadows. For many people, this experience is deeply confusing and sometimes even painful. The most common explanation people give is simple and harsh. They just don't care. But what if that explanation is completely wrong? What if the people we label as distant, cold, or emotionally unavailable are actually experiencing something far more complicated beneath the surface? What if their silence is not indifference, but protection? There is a controversial psychological perspective that flips the entire story upside down. It suggests that avoidance is not the absence of feeling, but in many cases the result of feelings that run so deep, they become overwhelming. And once you understand this perspective, the behavior that once seemed heartless suddenly starts to look like something entirely different. For most people, avoidant behavior feels like a personal rejection. When someone pulls away, the natural instinct is to assume the worst. We tell ourselves that we must have done something wrong, or that the other person simply doesn't value the connection enough to stay emotionally present. Society reinforces this idea constantly. Movies, social media, and everyday conversations paint avoidant individuals as people who fear commitment, lack empathy, or simply enjoy their independence too much to care about others. The story becomes very black and white. One person wants closeness, the other person runs from it. But human psychology is rarely that simple. When you look deeper into the hidden mechanics of the human mind, you start realizing that behaviors are often driven by forces we don't consciously understand. What appears like cold detachment from the outside may actually be the result of an internal battle that no one else can see. And once you begin to explore the hidden layers of that battle, the entire picture of avoidance begins to transform. There is a branch of psychology that focuses not only on what people say and do, but on the invisible forces shaping those actions from deep within the mind. According to this perspective, a huge portion of human behavior is controlled by unconscious patterns formed long before we are even aware of them. These patterns operate quietly beneath the surface, influencing the way we react to love, closeness, vulnerability, and emotional risk. When someone pulls away from intimacy, it might not be a calculated decision. It might actually be an automatic psychological defense triggered by something buried deep within their inner world. Imagine touching a hot surface. Your hand pulls away instantly before your brain even finishes processing what happened. In the same way, emotional withdrawal can sometimes be an instinctive response rather than a deliberate choice. The person withdrawing might not even fully understand why they are doing it. All they know is that something inside them is signaling danger, even when the relationship itself feels safe. This is where the idea of the hidden mind becomes extremely important. Beneath our everyday thoughts and conversations exists an entire psychological landscape that quietly shapes how we experience the world. Most of us like to believe that we are in full control of our emotions and decisions, but the truth is far more mysterious. Many of our reactions are influenced by memories, fears, and emotional impressions formed during the earliest chapters of our lives. These experiences become internal blueprints that determine how safe or unsafe closeness feels later on. For someone with avoidant tendencies, emotional intimacy can activate signals deep within the mind that associate closeness with vulnerability, pressure, or even pain. From the outside, the withdrawal looks intentional, but from the inside, it feels more like a survival instinct. It's not always about rejecting someone else. Sometimes it's about protecting a part of themselves that learned very early on that emotional exposure can be dangerous. If we travel even deeper into this psychological landscape, we discover that many avoidance patterns begin long before adult relationships ever appear. The early environment in which a person grows up quietly programs their expectations about connection. When emotional needs are consistently misunderstood, dismissed, or met with unpredictability, the mind begins developing strategies to adapt. One of those strategies is emotional independence. On the surface, independence can look strong, confident, and even admirable. But sometimes that independence forms as a shield. Instead of relying on closeness for safety, the mind learns to rely on distance. Instead of expressing vulnerability openly, emotions are carefully managed behind invisible walls. Over time, this protective structure becomes part of the person's identity. They may appear calm, rational, and self-contained, but what others see is only the outer layer of a much more complex inner world. And this is where one of the most fascinating ideas about human psychology emerges. The version of ourselves that the world sees is not always our full self. Every person develops a social mask designed to help them navigate relationships and expectations. This mask allows people to function smoothly in society, presenting the qualities that feel safest to reveal, while quietly hiding the parts that feel too sensitive, too chaotic, or too vulnerable. For someone who learned early in life that emotional openness can lead to discomfort or disappointment, this mask often takes the shape of cool independence. They may appear confident, logical, and unaffected by emotional drama. People might even admire how composed they seem. But what many fail to realize is that behind that composed exterior, there can exist a storm of emotions that rarely gets the chance to be expressed. The mask is not meant to deceive others. It is meant to protect the self. This protective mask becomes especially powerful in relationships. When someone begins getting closer emotionally, the mask can start feeling fragile. The deeper the connection grows, the greater the risk that hidden feelings and fears might become exposed. And when that risk becomes too intense, the mind activates its old protective strategies. Distance returns. Conversations become guarded. The person who once seemed warm suddenly feels unreachable. To the outside world, it looks like emotional indifference. But beneath the surface, something very different may be happening. The same defense system that once protected them during vulnerable moments in the past is now quietly guiding their reactions in the present. And unless those deeper patterns are understood, both people involved can end up trapped in confusion, wondering why connection suddenly turned into distance. As these protective masks become stronger over time, they slowly turn into a personality that the outside world begins to recognize. People start describing the person as independent, private, emotionally controlled, or difficult to read. And at first, this identity might actually feel empowering. Being the one who stays calm while others become emotional can create a sense of control. Being the one who doesn't depend on anyone can feel like strength. But something important is happening beneath the surface that few people realize. The mask that was originally created as protection slowly becomes the only version of the self that the person knows how to show. The deeper emotional layers remain hidden, even from themselves. Imagine wearing armor every single day. At first, it protects you from harm, but eventually the armor becomes so heavy that it prevents you from moving freely. It protects you from pain, yes, but it also prevents you from feeling warmth. And this is the quiet tragedy behind many avoidant personalities. The very shield that once helped them survive begins to isolate them from the connection they secretly long for. But what happens to the emotions that never get expressed? What happens to the fears, the vulnerability, the desire for closeness that sits quietly behind that mask? They do not disappear. Human emotions cannot simply be erased. Instead, they move into a hidden space inside the mind, where they continue to exist outside of conscious awareness. This hidden space holds the parts of ourselves that we were never taught how to express safely. The anger we felt but were told to hide. The sadness we buried because it felt unacceptable. The longing for reassurance that we learned to silence. Over time, these emotional fragments accumulate in the background of our inner world. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this hidden emotional landscape can become extremely intense. They may appear calm and unaffected on the outside, but internally, there may be a constant effort to keep those emotions contained, and this is where intimacy becomes complicated. When someone begins to get too close emotionally, it doesn't just bring warmth and affection, it also risks opening the door to all those buried emotions waiting in the shadows. This is why closeness can sometimes feel overwhelming rather than comforting. When another person starts offering deeper emotional connection, it can unintentionally activate everything that has been pushed beneath the surface for years. The vulnerability of intimacy becomes a spotlight shining directly into the hidden parts of the psyche. Suddenly, feelings begin to rise that the person has spent their entire life learning how to control. Fear appears without warning. Anxiety begins whispering in the background. A subtle sense of losing control starts creeping in, and the most confusing part is that the person experiencing these reactions may not fully understand why they feel this way. From the outside, the relationship might look healthy, caring, even beautiful. Yet inside their mind, something begins signaling that the emotional intensity is becoming too much to handle. So the protective system activates once again. Distance begins to feel safer than closeness. Silence begins to feel calmer than emotional exposure. And the person withdraws, not because they feel nothing, but because they suddenly feel too much. This is where one of the most surprising psychological paradoxes appears. Many people assume that avoidant individuals are emotionally detached or incapable of deep feeling. But what if the opposite is actually closer to the truth? What if avoidance is not a sign of emotional emptiness, but a response to emotional overload? Think about someone who becomes overwhelmed in a loud environment. The noise becomes so intense that they step outside just to breathe again. In a similar way, emotional closeness can sometimes become overwhelming for someone whose inner world is already filled with unprocessed feelings. The intensity of connection activates fears of vulnerability, fears of being misunderstood, fears of being hurt, and even fears of hurting someone else. Instead of leaning further into that emotional storm, the mind chooses the path it learned long ago: retreat. Distance restores a sense of control, silence quiets the noise, and the person convinces themselves that stepping away is the safest decision, even if part of them secretly wishes they could stay. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Because the desire for connection does not disappear simply because someone withdraws. In many cases, the longing for closeness continues quietly in the background. The person might miss the conversations, the laughter, the sense of being understood. They may replay moments of intimacy in their mind, wondering why something that felt so meaningful suddenly became so overwhelming. And this creates an internal conflict that is rarely visible to others. One part of the self wants to move closer, to experience the warmth of genuine connection. Another part of the self pulls back, warning that emotional exposure carries risks that are too dangerous to ignore. These two forces begin pulling in opposite directions, creating the classic push and pull dynamic that so many people experience in relationships with avoidant personalities. From the outside, it can feel confusing and even painful, but from the inside, it feels like trying to walk forward while an invisible force keeps pulling you backward. Over time, this internal struggle can slowly turn the original defense mechanism into something far more restrictive. What began as a temporary strategy for emotional protection starts shaping the entire way the person experiences relationships. Instead of approaching intimacy with curiosity and openness, they approach it with caution and hidden tension. Every deep conversation carries a subtle risk. Every moment of vulnerability feels like stepping closer to an emotional edge. And without realizing it, the person begins limiting how deeply they allow themselves to connect with others, not because they dislike connection, but because connection activates parts of themselves they have never fully learned how to face. The defense system that once protected them from pain now quietly keeps them at a distance from the very experiences that could bring healing. And this is the invisible prison that avoidance can create. The walls are not built by other people. They are built by protective patterns that the mind learned long ago, patterns that were once necessary, but that may no longer serve the person they have become. And this invisible prison begins revealing itself through small behaviors that many people notice but rarely understand. It shows up in delayed responses to messages that once felt effortless. It appears in conversations that suddenly become more logical than emotional. Feelings are replaced with analysis. Vulnerability is replaced with calm explanations. When tension appears in the relationship, the avoidant person often responds not with emotional expression, but with distance. They might say they need space, or they may quietly withdraw without fully explaining what they are experiencing inside. To someone on the receiving end, this behavior can feel deeply confusing and even hurtful. It feels like the connection is slowly fading without a clear reason. But what many people don't realize is that these behaviors are rarely meant to punish or reject anyone. They are protective responses that the mind automatically activates whenever emotional intensity begins rising beyond what feels manageable. Instead of confronting the emotional storm directly, the person steps back from it. Silence becomes a way to regain balance. Distance becomes a way to quiet the internal chaos that others cannot see. One of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant behavior is the appearance of emotional distance. On the surface, avoidant individuals often seem calm, composed, and almost untouched by the emotional waves that affect others. They might handle conflict with cool rationality, while their partner expresses strong feelings. They may appear unaffected after difficult conversations. This calm exterior can easily create the impression that they simply do not care as deeply, but that interpretation can be extremely misleading. Emotional restraint does not always mean emotional absence. In many cases, it means the opposite. Some individuals experience emotions so intensely that expressing them openly feels overwhelming or even frightening. Instead of allowing those emotions to spill out into the open, the mind works hard to keep them contained. The person becomes skilled at regulating their reactions, controlling their expressions, and maintaining an appearance of stability. But beneath that stability, the emotional experience may still be very real and very powerful. It simply happens quietly, behind a carefully maintained psychological barrier. This hidden intensity is where one of the most controversial ideas about avoidance begins to emerge. Contrary to the popular belief that avoidant individuals lack deep feelings, some psychological perspectives suggest that they may actually experience emotions with greater sensitivity than most people realize. Instead of being emotionally numb, they may be emotionally overloaded. The reason they step back from intimacy is not because connection means nothing to them, but because it means so much that it threatens to open emotional doors they have spent years trying to keep closed. When someone begins offering genuine closeness, trust, and vulnerability, it can stir emotions that have remained buried for a very long time. The excitement of connection mixes with fear. The warmth of affection collides with the anxiety of potential loss. Suddenly, the emotional stakes feel incredibly high, and when the mind senses that level of intensity, it instinctively looks for the safest path forward. For many avoidant individuals, that path has always been distance. But this is where the outside world often misinterprets the situation completely. People observing the withdrawal assume it reflects selfishness or lack of care. They may believe the avoidant person simply enjoys independence more than intimacy. Some even label them as emotionally unavailable or incapable of love. These judgments spread quickly because they seem to match the visible behavior. After all, when someone pulls away from connection, it looks like rejection. Yet, this interpretation ignores the deeper psychological story unfolding beneath the surface. The withdrawal may actually be happening because the emotional connection has become incredibly meaningful. Instead of feeling safe, that meaning triggers fears about vulnerability, exposure, and emotional dependence. The avoidant individual begins sensing risks that others cannot see, and in response, the mind activates the protective pattern it learned long ago. Step back, regain control, restore emotional balance. Another fascinating psychological dynamic also begins appearing during these moments of misunderstanding. When someone feels hurt by avoidant behavior, they naturally search for an explanation that makes sense of their pain. Sometimes that explanation involves projecting certain qualities onto the avoidant person. They might assume the other person is selfish, emotionally shallow, or incapable of commitment, but human relationships are complex mirrors. When we feel confused or wounded, our own fears and insecurities can quietly shape how we interpret another person's behavior. The mind tries to fill in the gaps of uncertainty with stories that feel emotionally satisfying, even if those stories are not entirely accurate. This projection creates a powerful cycle. The avoidant person withdraws because emotional intensity feels overwhelming. The other person interprets the withdrawal as rejection and becomes more anxious or frustrated. Their reaction increases emotional pressure in the relationship, which then causes the avoidant individual to retreat even further. Both people end up feeling misunderstood, even though neither one is intentionally trying to hurt the other. Inside the avoidant individual, this cycle can create an exhausting internal conflict. On one side exists the natural human desire for closeness, understanding, and companionship. That desire does not disappear simply because someone has learned to protect themselves emotionally. It remains present, quietly reminding them of the warmth and meaning that genuine connection can bring. But on the other side exists a deeply ingrained instinct that warns them about vulnerability. That instinct whispers that closeness can lead to disappointment, pressure, or emotional exposure that feels impossible to manage. As these two forces pull in opposite directions, the person begins living with a constant psychological tension. They may move closer to someone they care about, enjoying moments of genuine connection and openness, but when the emotional intensity grows too strong, the protective instinct activates again. Distance returns, silence returns, and the relationship enters the confusing push and pull pattern that leaves both people wondering what just happened. This silent inner struggle is one of the most overlooked realities of avoidant psychology. From the outside, the behavior appears simple. Someone moves away from intimacy, but inside the mind of the person experiencing it, the situation can feel incredibly complex. They may care deeply about the person in front of them. They may even wish they could express that care more freely. Yet at the same time, they feel an internal pressure urging them to step back before emotions become too intense. It is not always a conscious decision. Often it feels more like an automatic reaction, guided by old emotional memories and protective patterns that formed long ago. And until those hidden patterns are brought into awareness, the cycle tends to repeat itself again and again, shaping relationships in ways that both people struggle to understand. This internal tension doesn't just shape behavior, it begins shaping identity. Over time, the retreat from emotional intensity can subtly rewire how a person interacts with the world. Every new relationship, every attempt at closeness, carries echoes of the past. Even when someone consciously wants to connect, a quiet voice in the mind reminds them of the risks they've learned to fear. As a result, many individuals with avoidant tendencies create boundaries that feel invisible to others. These boundaries aren't arbitrary or cruel. They are carefully crafted shields meant to preserve equilibrium. But as these patterns repeat over months and years, the shield gradually becomes a barrier. The same protection that once offered safety now creates isolation. It separates them from the very experiences that could bring healing, warmth, and fulfillment. And the heartbreaking irony is that these people often crave connection as much as anyone else, yet their inner instinct for safety repeatedly guides them away from it. And this is where misunderstanding often spirals into judgment. Partners, friends, and loved ones may grow frustrated, confused, or hurt when someone withdraws unexpectedly. Why do they care so little? They ask themselves. Why can't they just open up? From the outside, the behavior can feel cold or dismissive, but this perspective completely misses the unseen struggle playing out inside the mind of the avoidant individual. Every withdrawal, every hesitation, every moment of quiet is often accompanied by a profound internal dialogue. They may be thinking about the very connection they want to maintain, while simultaneously worrying about the emotional intensity it brings. They may feel guilt over the distance they create, and yet be powerless to change the instinctive response that has been guiding them for years. The complexity of their inner world often goes unnoticed because outward behavior can look deceptively simple. This hidden inner conflict also explains the push and pull dynamic that can make relationships with avoidant individuals feel so unpredictable. When emotional closeness increases, so does the instinct to pull back. But as soon as distance is restored, the natural human longing for connection reemerges. This creates a cycle of approach and retreat, leaving both parties in a state of uncertainty. To someone experiencing it from the outside, it might feel like inconsistency, indecision, or emotional coldness. But from the perspective of the person inside, it feels like balancing a tightrope over a deep emotional chasm. Every step forward is exhilarating, but it is also terrifying because taking one step too far can stir emotions they feel unequipped to manage. Understanding this dynamic changes everything. What once seemed like indifference now becomes a signal of internal struggle, caution, and protective care rather than a lack of feeling. Interestingly, the very pattern that causes confusion in relationships can also act as a catalyst for personal growth. The repeated tension between closeness and distance forces awareness. It challenges the individual to recognize the parts of themselves that remain hidden, the fears they have long ignored, and the emotional patterns they have relied on for safety. Over time, some begin learning that withdrawing does not have to be the only response. They may slowly experiment with trust, openness, and vulnerability in measured ways. They begin realizing that while emotional intensity can be frightening, it does not always lead to harm. And as this awareness deepens, they gradually find a balance between maintaining safety and allowing connection. The push and pull dynamic does not completely vanish, but it transforms into a rhythm that supports growth rather than trapping them in fear. Finally, there is a critical lesson for anyone seeking to understand or be close to someone with avoidant tendencies. The behaviors that feel hurtful are rarely malicious, and the distance is rarely permanent. Behind every retreat lies a desire for connection, a longing for understanding, and a fear of being overwhelmed. Relationships with avoidant individuals are challenging, not because love is absent, but because emotions are intense, complex, and carefully managed behind the scenes. Awareness, patience, and empathy are essential. Recognizing that avoidance is often a response to emotional overload, not indifference, opens the door to understanding and even healing. It reminds us that what is avoided does not vanish. It waits to be acknowledged, integrated, and ultimately embraced. When this hidden emotional world is respected, it becomes possible to move beyond judgment and connect with the real heart behind the distance. Someone who feels deeply, even if their feelings are often invisible, and who may be quietly longing for the very connection that others fear is impossible to achieve.